Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. My name is Tommy, and we have a bit of a different setup today, so apologies for any differences in audio quality. We are recording on a joint mic in person because of some traveling stuff. But anyways, my name is Tommy. I'm one of your hosts as always, and I'm joined by my co-host, my dad, Matt. Dad, how are you doing?
Doing all right. Yeah, we're here recording together in person. We are bringing you this sweet Packers content after 10 hours of driving today.
Yes. So, we got so much energy for this Packers content. We're going to be today discussing a little bit about the 53-man roster. Because we were traveling, we unfortunately weren't able to put that podcast out yesterday like we had hoped. But we have some moves today that kind of make maybe this podcast a little more relevant. So, there are some pluses and some minuses for sure. But yeah, so we're going to discuss a little bit about the 53-man roster, what we thought about it, whose predictions were closer. You'll have to wait till the end to see who ended up having the more accurate 53-man roster in the end. But yeah, so lots to talk about. Before we get into any of that, though, just wanted to pitch a couple of things. If you like what you heard here today, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We tweet out when we have new episodes, articles we find interesting, pieces of Packers news, videos, clips, everything you can find, everything you would want to find Packers related, you can find on our Twitter. Once again, that's at FatherSonPacker, especially with the season coming up and starting in just 10 days now. It'd be a great place, essentially, to have a one-stop shopping for all things Packers. And then, if you like what you heard here in the podcast format, come subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. You can find us on any platform, even YouTube. We put all our episodes out there as well. If you subscribe to us on YouTube, that would really help our numbers, and we would really appreciate it. But yeah, thank you so much. Those are all of the pitches. But Dad, let's get into a little bit of the news for the Packers today. And really from the past week, I think the biggest thing was a former UW Wisconsin running back, Jonathan Taylor. And just to kind of give anyone who has been under a rock or not detrimentally online a bit of a timeline rundown of the situation, Jonathan Taylor, disgruntled star running back for the Indianapolis Colts. So on Wednesday, Stephen Holder of ESPN reported that the Packers were the quote-unquote mystery team interested in trading for Jonathan Taylor.
The mystery second team.
Yes, the mystery second team.
Because there was also already known that the Dolphins were in negotiations.
Yes. So Stephen Holder of ESPN reported the Packers were interested, which was certainly very surprising. Later that day, Ryan Wood reported that sources told him that those discussions never rose beyond the scout level, although Holder reported that the interest from the Packers was legitimate and definitely very present, and a serious interest in acquiring him. However, it does seem that the Colts' asking price was not exactly based in reality, as it was reported that they had requested from the Dolphins Jalen Waddle plus, which, if you know who Jalen Waddle is, that was pretty much a non-starter, I'm sure, for the Dolphins. Brian Gutekunst later, when asked in the press conference about Jonathan Taylor, pretty much just gave the old, can't talk about players and other teams, etc., etc., etc. But then today, on Thursday, Josina Anderson reported that sources had told her that both the Packers and Dolphins, but more interestingly, the Packers for our purposes, were willing to give Taylor a new contract that would make him one of the highest paid running backs in the league. So that is very interesting because when you look at the Packers roster, A.J. Dillon's going to be a free agent in 2024, and Aaron Jones is turning 30 next year and is kind of
a big contract for next year as well, and it'll be his like 8th year in the league. Next year is it's 7th this coming year, right? I think
that
and maybe
sounds right.
Next year, but this whole story just reeks of spin by the Colts. That they said, "Oh, Taylor, you can get you're free to pursue a trade." So he may have said, "Oh, I'm interested in the Packers since I played in Madison," and they're like, "Okay, we'll talk to the Packers." And we talked to them. We asked for all the stars. They said no, and so I guess we can't trade you to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different angles on this. From a Colts and Taylor perspective, I definitely do think it seems like this, we're giving you the option to go seek a trade, was not exactly done in good faith, in my opinion, especially when you look at what they were asking for from the Dolphins. We didn't even know what they were asking for from the Packers, which I'm sure it was completely ridiculous. Although I did see someone posit that, could there be do the Packers have offensive linemen that the Colts might be interested in? That was something that was kind of positive, but I didn't look any further into how the cap maneuverings of that would work, because I think that was also a problem, is that in order for the Packers to take on Taylor, they would also need to give him a new contract, because the cap hit this year would be
and I think
it wouldn't work.
I think Ken Ingalls had a rundown of some stuff they would maybe have to do, like giving Gary his extension to open up cap, since he's on his fifth-year option this year. They could actually reduce this year's hit by extending him. But just because the Packers are willing to sign Taylor to a new contract and extend him at normal, doesn't mean they're necessarily willing to pay what the Colts are asking in any way, shape, or form.
And also, I'm not entirely sure that the Packers would be willing to give a contract of that nature. I think that also kind of smells like his agent trying to pump up his value. In my opinion, that's kind of what it sounds like to me. Is like, oh, look at all these other teams are totally willing to give him this massive contract. Like tons of teams are lining up out the door to give Taylor a ton of money.
Then the Colts on their side are saying, well, look, if you were really this valuable, they'd be trading this stuff for you. It's definitely a lot of back and forth going on.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of posturing, really, and there's really no way of knowing. It is important to note, though, that while this trade did not happen, Taylor is still able to be traded. He still missed the first 4 games of the season because he is on PUP.
Which is the other thing that happened, like just before the deadline. They decided not to activate him, but to leave him on PUP before a cut down, so he has to miss the first 4 weeks of the season.
Yeah, but so hypothetically, the Packers could still trade for him. And so that, if that smoke is real, we might not be done with this story yet, so keep your ears tuned.
Presumably, the asking price will continue to go down if it happens later in the year.
Yes. But beyond that, though, there is some other pieces of Packers news that are probably more substantive, and that is that today, Jordy Nelson and Josh Sitton were enshrined in the Packers Hall of Fame, which is very exciting. Some good news for them. Some more less confusing news, I guess, more straightforward news for the Packers. But, Dad, that's pretty much the only real news and notes in Green Bay right now. The only other thing to really talk about is what we're here to talk about today, the 53-man roster. Now, you might notice in our feed, we have broken down the first and second preseason games for the Packers, but we do not have an episode dedicated to the third preseason game. In our opinion, the game against the Seahawks was a bit nondescript. If you want like a brief rundown, in my opinion, I thought Jordan Love probably throwing the football had one. I think both preseason games 1 and 2 were better. But in game 3, I think he showed the most amount of athleticism he had showed so far in any of those games in terms of evading pressure, having to move in the pocket, having to move outside of the pocket, etc., etc. Beyond that, the only other items of note were that Malik Heath got the start in place of Romeo Doubs, who had a hamstring injury, so that's something to keep in mind looking forward. And we'll be talking about all that injury-related news next week when we do our pregame pod for the game 10 days away, season opener against the Bears. Very exciting. But yeah, so that we felt that the Seahawks game was a bit nondescript and that this episode might be a bit better used talking about the 53-man roster, which is more current news and really was all these preseason games we're building to anyways. And we'll have plenty to talk about. We'll probably be referencing the preseason games a little bit when we talk about our pregame pod next week for the Bears. And starting next week, we'll be starting to do 2 episodes a week, so keep an eye out for that. But Dad, 53-man roster-wise, let's get into it. Some things to keep in mind, just as a bit of an overview. Position-wise, the Packers kept 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 6 receivers, 4 tight ends, 10 offensive linemen, 5 defensive linemen, 6 edges, 4 inside linebackers, 4 corners, and 6 safeties. And that is not the initial 53. What we are basing this off of is their 53 as of today, after all these moves have been finalized, so to speak. So that is not including Luke Tenuta, who was put on IR, Jonathan Ford, who was cut after initially making the 53, Tariq Carpenter, who was cut after initially making the 53, etc. So that's just something to keep in mind there. But as an overview, this is, and some of these numbers are from Wes Hodkiewicz, who works for Packers.com. This is the most edges kept by a Matt LaFleur Packers team. Another piece of interesting another interesting item to note is they have kept 4 tight ends every year for the Packers under LaFleur. While they originally had 3, they did sign Ben Sims they claimed him off of waivers, I should say. an additional tight end. He had been with the Vikings originally and had been released by them, and then was picked up by the Packers. And we'll talk more about him later, and as well as some other new Packers. And then 4 corners is the fewest that they've had under LaFleur.
And the only time they've had that few. And the other thing about this, so O-line is like tied for the most with 10. That's something, though they started with 11, which they'd never done.
Yes.
Maybe never done before. But then Tenuta went straight to IR, as everybody expected, because when he first got hurt, said it's a long-term injury, but not season-ending. Clearly, they didn't think it was season-ending since they went through this little, trick to get him onto a 4-week IR and not season-ending IR.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into that a little bit more. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting was, so many people were like, oh, they're definitely only going to keep 2 running backs. It's very unlikely that they keep 3.
One of those people's right here.
Yep. And I also had them keeping 2. But when you look at over the past few years, they have only kept 2 last year. Previously, they have kept 3, 4, and 3 in the 3 previous years in 2021, 2020, and 2019. So it does seem like, that 2 last year was kind of a special circumstance in that they thought that they could get Taylor back on the practice squad last year, and they could, and then they have Taylor back on the practice squad this year. But Emmanuel Wilson, undrafted free agent, makes the team for the Packers, as well as Malik Heath and Brenton Cox. So 3 undrafted free agents to continue the streak for the Packers, which is very exciting. But Dad, let's start going position by position since we're already starting to talk about some specific players. And let's start with quarterbacks. I think we can breeze through this one.
This is like the smallest surprise of the whole thing. I don't think anybody expected them to have more than 2. And we'd already basically been told that Clifford was the backup, so we already knew that Love and Clifford were going to be the 2 quarterbacks.
Yes, so Love and Clifford were the 2 quarterbacks. I don't think we really need to do much discussion here. I
have one note about this. Chalk. Yeah. That's all I wrote.
And I think Clifford really earned this backup spot.
He was so much better than I expected in the preseason. He was, he was not lacking in confidence. He bounced back from mistakes. And his arm was better than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, he had a very good preseason, and it did pretty much everything they asked of him. Beat out Danny Etling almost immediately, and pretty much as soon as they cut Etling, it was like, okay, so Clifford's the number 2, and he was the number 2 in all but official naming, and then that happened last week, and it was writing on the wall. But Dad, let's move on to running back, where we have something a little more interesting. Like we were mentioning earlier, I mean, obviously, Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon, we're going to get those top 2 spots. Last year, they were the only 2 running backs on the roster, like we were discussing, but Emmanuel Wilson. Did you have this on your bingo card at the start of preseason training camp, off-season?
Certainly not at the start. And I was, early on in preseason, I was my guy for the number 3 spot. Though it didn't mean he was going to be on the roster, but for the number 3 running back was Goodson.
Yes.
Before we had seen Emmanuel Wilson play and knew what he could do at whatever he is, 25 pounds heavier than Goodson.
And it's a shame for Goodson because I think, if he hadn't gotten hurt, he might have still been able to compete for that 3rd running back spot. But I mean, Wilson these stats are from Zach Cruz on Twitter. Wilson in the preseason led the NFL in rushing, led the NFL in forced missed tackles, had the longest run in the preseason, had tied for the lead for number of carries for 10-plus yards in the preseason. I mean, there was really not much more he could have done, and he really earned a spot. This is a quote from Brian Gutekunst from his presser. Quote, his growth and certainly where his upside is was certainly a part of the decision. And something to kind of keep in mind here is that, like we were saying when we were discussing Jonathan Taylor, Jones and Dillon might not be on the team next year, and Emmanuel Wilson might be the only running back on the roster in 2024, or is the only back currently on the roster that would be on the roster in 2024. That's certainly a possibility. And so it seems like when he's discussing growth and upside, it kind of seems like he's a player, and we'll talk about some players later, where they're kind of looking at him for 2024 and looking at a lot of these players where they're keeping their eye on next year. And I think that kind of is something to keep in mind, where they're adding a lot of players this year who are young, who might not contribute this year, and Packers fans should keep that in mind if they ever feel frustrated by errors of young players. I'm specifically thinking about, I think Love will have some ups and downs that we'll keep in mind. I think just they're building towards 2024 there. I think is what their goal is. Carlson is a big one at kicker. I think he's going to miss kicks that are going to lose them games. And I think the Packers are willing to deal with that. Now, whether or not you agree with that is different, but I think that that's just something to keep in mind. And you see it with Wilson. We'll talk about it with Cox later, where he's kind of buried on the depth chart right now, but he has a bigger chance at a role in 2024. But that's kind of something with Wilson, Dad. Kind of to circle back there, did you have anything that you wanted to add there, or anything on what I was just saying?
I think in general it seems abundantly clear that they are planning to live with mistakes for younger players. Though Gutekunst said we weren't trying to get younger, we were just trying to get faster and more athletic. Though they're also trying to get cheaper contracts.
To me that's like saying we weren't trying to get younger, we were just trying to get players with later birth. Like, okay, there's just a direct correlation between,
but they also got players faster than the fastest some of the previous players ever were.
That's fair.
But they're willing to live with things like there are going to be drops, there are going to be missed blocks, there are going to be missed kicks, there are going to be interceptions, and they're like, it's part of the growth process. I think we're going to have to live with it. That's basically what they've decided. Everything they've told us by action and words is that's what they're decided to live with.
And the thing is, it's like, they have a lot of dead cap this year. So so it's like it's kind of makes sense for this to be see what you have in some of these young players, let them develop together, let Love and the young receivers kind of develop a rapport and kind of go through the growing pains. And it just makes sense. And then they'll have some cash to spend next year in free agency. It just, that kind of tracks for me. And that kind of leads into the circling back to Emmanuel Wilson. It kind of makes sense to keep a guy who has shown a lot in the preseason, who they think has kind of grown a lot through camp, who would be cheap in 2024. It just, that kind of tracks for like the overall, kind of overall objective and overall like viewing of the roster through that lens, I guess. And I think we should try and, keep that perspective throughout the season, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, if Love and the receiver aren't on the right page and Love throws an out and the receiver's hitting it in and it goes for a pick six, just deep breath. It's all about just taking those lumps and getting better through them. But that's the running back room, Dad. Anything else you wanted to talk about there?
Yeah, so I must admit that I was a little surprised at him making it because I was expecting two, as I said earlier. But, and what I would say is that I think they picked the guy who seems like the best runner out of the possible backups. Despite what everybody was saying about it's all about special teams play and blitz pickup and blocking, they picked the guy who was the best runner. And so some of it makes you think, okay, they're planning for the future. Maybe as early as 2024, he could be a top two back and maybe not two.
On the team.
In the league. Are you kidding?
Well,
but and so at least I suspect that's part of their thinking here. I think a lot of the players are actually testing out this year. They're testing them out for how good they could be when they have an even bigger role for the ones who aren't already starters in 2024.
And when you bring up the special teams aspect, would you be entirely surprised if they inactive Wilson on game days and activate Patrick Taylor and just have Patrick Taylor up to play? I'm not even kidding.
No.
Have Patrick Taylor up to play special teams and just deactivate Wilson and just Wilson's redshirting. Like they just like him as a runner, but they think Patrick Taylor would contribute more this year, and so they'll activate Patrick Taylor for a few games. Wilson probably won't see the field very much.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. In fact, I can't remember the situation, but I believe they have done this already on numerous occasions.
Now I'm trying to remember. It's tough.
Did they have any D linemen play last year
instead of Ford?
Of Ford, because Ford didn't play a single game, for example.
Yeah,
and I think there may be others like safeties or. I think there've been cases where this has happened before.
It's tough.
Somebody's been called. I can't. I remember thinking about this last year, though I can't recall it right now. But I would say, just speaking about a little bit of that last preseason game, that it's possible that Emmanuel Wilson helped his cause with a good pass pro rep in the last preseason game. And I think you can probably find that clip shared by Eddie Herman on Twitter.
Yeah, he was the one.
I don't have access to the game some other way.
He pointed it out, and that was where I had first noticed it because he had pointed it out from the end zone angle, and you can really see it there. But, it's something that's, I don't think he's going to hit him 100% of the time, but he showed he was able to do it.
100% of the time,
50% of the time,
it works every time.
But that's the thing is, like, he showed has the ability to do it, and I feel like this is such a Matt LaFleur platitude, but, like, it's about consistency after that. But anyway, that's kind of all there is around the running backs. Definitely one of the bigger surprises in the rooms, but, maybe it shouldn't have been. I mean, he tore apart the preseason. But let's move on to wide receiver, Dad. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Samori Toure, Malik Heath, and Dontavian Wicks make the team. 6 players there. My big takeaways are the fact that they kept Heath over DeBose, despite them both being rookies, and they drafted DeBose in the 7th round, and Malik Heath was an undrafted free agent. This probably shouldn't be a surprise, though, because it definitely seemed like Heath had kind of jumped to the depth chart as he started over Doubs in the last preseason game against the Seahawks.
He started in place of Doubs.
Yes.
Over Toure.
Yes, thank you. That's important to say. Started in place of Doubs with injury, like we were talking about earlier when we were doing a brief talk about the Seahawks game. And they just seemed to really like Heath. DeBose got put a little bit behind the 8 ball. He missed so much of the offseason with injury. And they were able to get him back on the practice squad, so that's exciting that they're able to have both of them. But I think that's the big thing. And then my other big takeaway was the fact that Wicks was not put on short-term IR, which we were both a little concerned he might have been, which maybe indicates that, maybe this hamstring injury is pretty minor, and hopefully he'll be back in a couple of weeks. Fingers crossed, knock on wood, obviously. But, I thought that was good news that he wasn't put on short-term IR. Dad, what did you think about the receiver room?
Yeah, so I was expecting 7, but paired with only 2 running backs. So I think they kept a 3rd running back and not a 7th wide receiver. Though, and I had been thinking that because they took 7 last year. But one thing more recently that I was realizing about last year is they kept 7, I think, more for the future because they knew they had several receivers who had contracts ending that they weren't going to be bringing back, like Lazard and Cobb. I think they feel like these guys are on their last year here, so we've got to prepare for the future. Now, everybody's in their 1st or 2nd year, so everybody's got a future. So they're not planning for somebody to basically like age out of the team, as it were, next year. Another thing I was thinking about in terms of keeping 7 is I was practically expecting Wicks to be put on short-term IR for the first 4 weeks. So they'd keep 7, he'd go to IR, and then they'd have 6, like is one of the more common numbers of wide receivers they've had. So that's something that I didn't really expect. And the other question I have now is Heath wide receiver 4 now?
Yeah, we were discussing this beforehand, and I think it really depends on who needs filling in for. I think if it's an outside receiver, it definitely seems like, as of right now, they would have Heath fill in that spot. But I think if Jaden Reed were to miss time, I think they would have Samori Toure fill in the slot. So I would say Heath is outside receiver 3. But, I think they view those positions a bit differently right now. And I think that Toure would take any slot snaps that were possibly missing. But I think it's a good note because, Heath had a really good, offseason leading into training camp with, rookie minicamp, OTAs, and minicamp. And then kind of start of training camp, struggled a little bit, ran around route, dropped the ball, if you remember, when he was having reps with Clifford, I believe it was.
It was all the reports out of the spring practices that this guy looks amazing. And then the very beginning of training camp, he looked like he was struggling. So, it's not carrying over. But then he, I guess, got his feet under him.
He put it back together, But yeah, so it's really exciting for him. Did you see the tweet about he tweeted out about Madden?
No, I missed the tweet about Madden.
He tweeted Wes Hodkiewicz had this. He was like, I'm on the 53 man. I'm in the game. I'm on the roster. I loaded it up last night and I was throwing myself nothing but go balls. I'm still living the dream.
Is that how he found out he was on the 53?
No.
I checked on Madden, and that's how I found out I was on the 53. This is gonna be the new way that rosters are gonna be. Madden would love it if this is the way rosters were released.
But both him and Emmanuel Wilson actually put out on their own Instagram and broke that they made the 53.
They did before the team did.
Yes.
That people were reporting went, it looks like he's made it. Like he's announced it himself.
Yes, but
and the other thing I was going to say about Heath is, and I think probably helps him in getting onto the team is he seems to be embracing the goon role.
Yeah, what was it? Matt LaFleur called him that. He said we're missing. I think he essentially implied like, without Lazard there, they're going to need like another goon, like another like tough guy who's going to do the dirty work. And I still remember that first game against the Bengals. He blocked a dude clean out of bounds about 6 yards, which was awesome.
There were a fair number of people on social media like, oh, I think he just earned himself a roster spot.
Yeah, I'm sure that woke LaFleur up like right away. He said, "Oh, that's very interesting." But anyway, besides that, though,
that's the meme of the guy standing behind the tree.
Yes, the rubbing his hands together. Yeah, but no, I think it definitely seems like. Besides that, it wasn't really anything surprising. I'm glad they were able to get DeBose back on the practice squad because he had some nice moments in camp and a nice moments in preseason, but he just had to struggle with so many injuries. Yeah,
and I did hear a little bit of speculation that he was given very little time in preseason game 3 to essentially hide him just a little bit more, so that he'd be more likely to make it through waivers.
Well, was he held out of preseason game 3?
Well, I think he played a little bit.
Okay. But anyway, beyond that, though, Dad, do you want to move on to tight ends, where the Packers kept Luke Musgrave, obviously, Josiah DeGuara, Tucker Kraft, and then added Ben Sims. Dad, do you want to talk a little bit about Ben Sims?
Yeah, so he was one of their 2 waiver claims. So the Packers put in 3 waiver claims and got 2. Ben Sims was tight end. He's 6'4", 250 pounds. He's a rookie from Baylor. He was originally signed by Minnesota, and so Minnesota waived him, and they had given him like $110,000 guaranteed as a UDFA, 10,000 bonus, and then 100,000 guaranteed salary. So the Packers take on those guarantees by claiming it off of waivers. If he doesn't get claimed off waivers, then that guarantee is null and void. He had a good pass blocking grade by PFF. So I think this is, as a college senior, I think this is one of the things that the Packers were most interested in. So 76.1 grade as for pass blocking. Has 8.4 RAS with good speed and good jumps, both vertical and long jump, but poor agility and size kind of average for a tight end. Not particularly huge as a like Mercedes Lewis style blocking tight end.
Yeah, and it seems like he was someone that they were definitely interested in. I mean, they brought him in on a top 30 visit pre-draft. He's a rookie. He was undrafted in this last draft. And they're going to be paying him a good amount of money. They're going to be paying him $100,000, according to Andy Herman. Despite, according to Rob Domofsky, they only paid as much as $9,000 guaranteed to any other undrafted free agent this year.
Right. And it should say they're paying him $100,000 guaranteed.
Yes.
The salary overall will be more if he's on the roster the whole year.
Yes, and that's more based on the contract that he signed with the Vikings, but the fact that they were willing to take on that amount of money really shows that they really liked him. And it seems like a good move. It doesn't seem like he's necessarily elite at any one particular thing, but it seems like, he's kind of decent all around, and, should be a nice like depth piece going forward. I think Tucker Kraft, it seemed like in the preseason, was kind of volatile, especially as a blocker. He'd have some good reps blocking, he'd have some absolute whiffs. And so, I think, maybe there's a scenario where they play Sims a little bit more for the stability, but at the same time, it is a bit of a developmental year for most of the players on the roster, and they might just live with some of the ups and downs with Kraft. But, you could see a scenario where they're like, okay, like we need a stabilizing force in the tight end room right now. Like we need a guy who's going to hit all of his blocks on the end line in special teams, for instance, like the block PAT the other day. Like
Kraft.
That Kraft whip.
I think he just didn't. It wasn't a Simon short, and that one is my understanding. Not that he got blown up on the block.
Yeah, no, he just didn't block him. But yeah,
but we should say about this, he's not just a lumbering blocker. I mean, he's got elite speed at 4.58 in the 95th percentile.
Yeah, but I think I think he's a better blocker. I think they might trust him a little more as a blocker right now than Kraft, but we'll see. I think this is maybe a case of the unknown is more enticing than the known, because we've seen Kraft kind of miss some blocks.
That is the story of almost all professional sports and college sports. Like, we're going with somebody who might be good rather than somebody we know isn't.
Not that we don't think Kraft is good. It's just that right now Kraft has struggled at times to block. But I also saw Dusty Evely posted a really great clip of Tucker Kraft blocking on the on a run outside for Patrick Taylor, which was awesome. And Dusty's a great follow. You got to find him on Twitter if you're looking for anything Packers. I mean, he's just the best.
But I would add, I didn't necessarily mean that Kraft. They already think is no good. He's in the we're adding this guy we think might be great. He's in the we're adding guys we're not sure yet who could be great.
Yes, but let's move on to the offensive line, where the Packers originally kept 11 before moving Tenuta to IR, and now have 10. Josh Myers, Elton Jenkins, David Bakhtiari, John Runyon Jr., Zach Tom, Rasheed Walker, Yash Nyman, Sean Ryan, Caleb Jones, and Royce Newman. Pretty straightforward. I thought they might not keep Newman, but interior O-line is pretty thin for them right now. And I would guess he's probably their 10th guy, and how many teams really have very many good 10th linemen, to be fair. But yeah, it was nice to be able to get Tenuta on that short-term IR and stash him. That was I didn't have many other thoughts. They're a little tackle-heavy, but, their better players are tackles, so...
Yeah, so even though I had Newman on my own initial 53 prediction, I really didn't expect him to make it because he'd been playing so poorly in the preseason and seemed to be getting worse every year in the league. But in the end, I think they just felt like they didn't have enough interior offensive linemen. They got like 6 tackles and four interior offensive linemen. Let they start moving people around in multiple positions to make up for it.
You could argue their third best interior lineman is a tackle.
Their third best interior lineman is their second best tackle.
Yeah, that's probably fair, which is a little alarming. But
actually, you could argue that their second best interior offensive lineman is their second best tackle.
Yeah, I guess you could make the argument that Tom is better than John Runyon Jr., but we haven't seen Tom play that much interior line. I think this is another case of the unknown better than the known. I would say John Runyon Jr. is a better interior lineman right now than Zach Tom. I gotta see Zach Tom actually play with more play strength along the interior in an actual NFL game before I'm gonna say that.
I would say you can't say either way. It is an unknown.
We've seen John Runyon Jr.
calling it an unknown.
We've seen John Runyon Jr. be a starting guard in the NFL for 3 years now, so I don't think that's fair to him. He's only ever committed 1 penalty in his entire career, which is kind of crazy. But that's the line. Not really much there. They seem really high on Caleb Jones. Back-to-back years, they have kept him on the 53, despite him being more of a developmental guy.
I've thought since the beginning of last year that he is on the Yash Nyman path.
Yes, and I think it's tough because you wonder if at his size he can ever really be a great run blocker, but they do seem to like him a lot. But that's kind of it for the offense. Let's move on to the defense, starting with the defensive line. Kenny Clark, TJ Slayton, Devontae Wyatt, Colby Wooden, Carl Brooks. Jonathan Ford initially made the 53, but then was cut. Any thoughts? I think this is pretty chalk. This is not much here to talk about for me.
Yeah, I was expecting 6, which happened on the initial. I was a little surprised they cut Ford when they that he was one of the ones they chose to cut when they claimed 2 players from waivers, and he's not yet signed to the practice squad. Maybe he doesn't want to come back. Maybe they're still figuring out how to do it, and he made it through waivers and has not yet signed with the team. So we'll see what happens with that, because I thought he actually took a big jump this year, and I saw that they kept him
that's the thing
on the roster all last year, and he didn't look nearly as good. Didn't play a minute, wasn't active for a single game, and now when he finally starts to play better,
that's the thing. Cut him. It doesn't really make sense to not have him back unless he feels like there might be better opportunities for him somewhere else. And it's weird because he wasn't as good in preseason games 2 or 3 as he was in preseason game 1. I thought in the Bengals game I was like, this is a different player. I've never seen this guy before in my life. But so it is a little odd. I think that's a good point, but it makes sense. The 5 they kept are, I think, a clear cut ahead of Ford is the thing. Like those 5 are still a tier. There's a tier break between the 5th one and Ford still, in my opinion.
Yeah, it depends what you're looking for. I would say.
I
would say Wooden and Brooks have shown a lot of pass rush juice, but Ford is he's like their run stuffer that they don't have another. This would be the argument for having him on the practice squad, where if Slayton or Kenny have to miss some time, you can't just have one nose tackle.
Here's the thing: he is big enough to play nose tackle. Are we sure he's that good a run defender? Because at the same time, like it's not like we've seen it really. Like we're just saying, oh, they need him for run defense. It's like, okay, but are we can't say for certain he's actually
he provides
defense.
a body type that the other players don't have.
That is true. He's a good 50 to 60 pounds heavier than either Wooden or Brooks, which is a good point. But let's move on to edge, Dad, where I think this is one of the other more interesting positions that they chose to go with, because they went with 6 edges, which is a lot. Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, Lucas Van Ness, Kingsley, JJ Enagbari, Justin Hollins, and Brenton Cox. Brenton Cox, Dad, one of 3 UDVAs to make the team. Another one of the guys that I think is kind of a plan for 2024 type player, because right now he's pretty much buried on the roster 6th. I would not imagine he's going to be active on many game days. He doesn't play much special teams, but he's got a lot of pass rush juice. He had a high pedigree coming out of high school. There's a lot of talent there. And next year, with Preston and Hollins kind of possibly moving on, it definitely seems like this is a redshirt year essentially for him.
Yeah, in some ways, I'm thinking of him a little bit as not an extra draft pick for this year, but an extra draft pick for next year, where he could potentially be edge 4 for the Packers, because it's not unreasonable to think that I think Hollins might be in the last year of his contract, and Preston they decide that it's time to move on from yet another high-priced veteran on the team. Seems to be they've been doing that across the whole roster the last couple of years. So I was kind of predicting that they would keep him, even though it's a 6th edge rusher and he might not play, maybe not at all this year, but he might be better than anybody they could get in the 4th round or later as a edge flyer next year.
Yeah, and it sounds like, they really liked him. He had a really good preseason, I thought, and this was something we had been talking about, you and I, about it's 6 edges, but I think him as the 6th edge is better than whatever extra 5th corner or 6th safety they might keep. So, and we'll talk about the corners.
And we've seen that. We've seen what that 6th safety looks like now.
Yeah, and so it makes sense at the edge room. I don't expect Brenton Cox to play much this year, unless there's injuries at the position. But I think he's definitely talented enough where they weren't going to get him back if they got him.
He's if you have an edge rusher who looks like he could play some snaps in the NFL now, you weren't going to get him back.
No, not at all. And it's a blessing to have an edge room this deep, really.
Yeah.
And it sounds like they're going to have Rashawn Gary on a pitch clock, or a pitch count. It's was what Matt LaFleur was saying initially. But Gary might be ready for week 1, it sounds like, but they're not going to have him on a full complement of snaps initially. And, you never know. Maybe those first few weeks, someone gets a little, pulls a little something in practice leading up to it. Gary's on a pitch count, and then that player can't play, and suddenly they need Cox to play real snaps. You never know.
Yeah. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, you mentioned this is the 3rd UDFA for this year. And they had, I think, 13 draft picks and kept 11 of them.
Yep.
And they had 11 draft picks last year that are still on the team now.
It's a very young team. It's the youngest team. It's
25 players on the 53 just from the last 2 drafts.
Well, what was it? It's the youngest team, and we should have mentioned this at the beginning, youngest team in the last 6 years in the NFL?
In the entire NFL, not just for the Packers, the youngest team in the entire NFL over the last 6 years.
The average age of the team is 24.9. It's younger than me. Isn't that crazy to think about?
It depends on how you calculate it. I have seen that people are calculating just taking their listed age as opposed to 25 and whatever. Ken Ingalls did this, actually. He said just looked at the number of days. And so then it's more than 25 and a half. I forget the actual number if you figure out all the days. Of course, then I don't know how that compares to everybody else's.
That's true.
They probably weren't calculated with that much precision, detail.
Yeah.
But it is so the youngest in 6 years is kind of great. And
that was, the goal was to be more athletic and faster. The goal was to have that's like saying the goal is to have players with less wrinkles. Our goal wasn't to be younger. Our goal was to.
I think it actually was. Our goal was to have players with cheap contracts.
Also, yes, they got a lot of dead money this year. But Dad, do you want anything else you wanted to touch on with the edge players? Or do you want to move on to linebackers?
I think it's exciting to have this much edge depth. I don't know how long it's been since they had this many. Well, even the whole front, the D line and the edge together. I don't remember a time when they had this much potential pass rush up front. It's been a long time.
You say that, but I'm going to push back and say the year that they had Za'Darius, Preston, Gary, and Whitney Merciless was probably...
Except they only had Z for like one game that year.
That's true, but on paper, I think that was probably the best one, because that's insane. Yeah, that's a crazy four.
Though their D-line wasn't as deep.
I have questions about our D-line. I am a little worried at how little we've seen from Wyatt in the preseason. He did not do a whole lot. He didn't beat out Slayton.
Slayton
we'll see.
Looked like he's improved a lot. We'll see if Wooden and Brooks, how well they perform when they're up against number ones instead of just... It seems clear that our number 2 D-line is better than anybody else's number 2 O-line.
Which is most teams, I would say. Most teams second.
But our number 2 O-line...
that's fair.
Is kicking everybody else's number 2s. Our number 1 and number 2 O-line... They get up like one pressure all preseason.
It's not much, whatever it was. It was not very many. But let's move on to linebacker dad, where the Packers kept 4 linebackers: Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, Isaiah McDuffie, Eric Wilson. And this kind of just, to me, came down to...
That they have on the 53 right now.
Yes, and they kept Carpenter initially too, but then they released him, and to add Zane Anderson, who we'll talk about a little bit. He is a safety. But it kind of just seemed like it would come down to which of Eric Wilson and Carpenter they like more. They seem to like Wilson more. I think that's the right choice. I think Wilson's a more experienced player. I think he's a better special team player. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah. So what they've ended up with now, after the waiver claims, is what I was predicting, where they'd have 4 linebackers, Campbell, Walker, McDuffie, and Wilson being the 4th. Because I thought he looked better when he was in on defense than Carpenter. In terms of Carpenter, he'd make some splash plays, but also take some bad angles and get beat.
He's just inexperienced at the position, and there were reports that he didn't really want to play linebacker anyway. So it's like, okay, go you play somewhere that'll let you play safety. I think he signed with the Steelers practice squad. But yeah,
so he made it through waivers without being claimed and signed with the Steelers today. And so I think this was the most likely. Having 5 inside linebackers seemed like a bit rich for the position,
especially when the 4th one is already a special team only player. You don't want him to play snaps.
Two of them being special teamers. Yeah, and McDuffie's, even though he's the 3rd linebacker, is also probably going to play a lot of special teams.
Yeah, and I thought McDuffie looked pretty good in his preseason action that we saw. He's just a little small, and the problem is sometimes he gets bullied by offensive linemen.
And with Campbell out, he was on the field a lot as sometimes the solo linebacker.
Yeah, and I think it was either Gutekunst or LaFleur said they are hopeful that Campbell will be able to play week 1, which is good news. There was a bit of a question mark there. But definitely something to keep an eye on and something we'll talk about in next week's episode. Let's move on to corner, though, Dad. Only 4 of them. Jair Alexander, Rasul Douglas, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine, and then keep in mind that Eric Stokes is still on PUP. He will have to miss at least the first 4 weeks.
This is maybe the biggest surprise of the entire roster, to go into a season with only 4 corners. If you look, and that's by far the lightest they've had. Well, not by far. It's the only time they've had 4 in the last 6 years. They had 2 times they had 5, and 2 times they had 6.
Yeah, and the thing here, I think, optimistically, you could say, oh, maybe it means that they're feeling that Stokes will be back week 5, and that they can kind of make it to there with 4 corners. At the same time, they also have 3 corners on the practice squad who they could call up. In Ennis Gaines, Corey Ballantyne, and Keandre Thomas. So I would not be surprised if we saw some of those guys get called up. But, definitely a little bit tight at the corner room. Probably going to be seeing a lot of extra safeties playing some of those dime snaps, I would imagine.
Yeah, so my thoughts about this, only 4 seems kind of low. I kept looking for one of the others. Like, I was thinking maybe Ballantyne was be added, though I was going back and forth. Is it going to be Ballantyne? Is it going to be Gaines? Is it going to be John Charles, based on who just made a good play that day? So in the end, I had Ballantyne as my 5th one. So, but maybe the plan for now is I'll call somebody up for the first few weeks to have a 5th corner, or maybe Savage is just going to be in the slot in a pinch if they need another corner. And then we'll end up with, going further down the safety depth chart.
Yeah, but it's a bit of a plateau, is all I'm going to say. The further you go down the safety depth
You
chart,
think that's a plateau?
it's a valley. It's a very very long valley.
No plateau.
But anyway, that's the corner. On to safeties where they kept 5 initially and then signed Zane Anderson. Or claimed Zane Anderson off waivers, I should say. Darnell Savage, Rudy Ford, Jonathan Owens, Anthony Johnson Jr., Dolan Levitt, the immortal one, and Zane Anderson. Dad, what a safety room. I mean, just loaded with talent. Do you want to talk a little bit about Zane Anderson, the newest Packer?
So he's listed. So I've seen him listed as a safety in some sites, sometimes listed as a corner. He was claimed off waivers after the Bills cut him. He had actually spent the last 2 years on the Chiefs practice squad. He's pretty athletic. As a free safety, he has a RAS of 8.26 with good size, good speed, and great agility. But he seems like yet another special teamer. He was better in his special team snaps than on defense at BYU, and he has, I think, 1 NFL snap over his career, which is a little unclear what that is. It may have been like lined up as special teams, but then was a fake or something. But he seems like yet another. So the safety room is a little bit odd in some ways that they have 6 of them, and at least 2 of them seem to be only special teamers, I think. I think Zane Anderson and Levitt, they have to be really desperate, I think, to put those 2 guys out as safeties. I think their plan is for them to be core special teamers.
Yeah, and for Anderson, for him, I think he's very similar to Carpenter in my mind. Last year, he did, though, played on kick coverage, kick return, punt coverage, and punt return. So he's got some versatility that's per PFF. Versatility as a special teamer. It feels like he's a little redundant with Dallin Levitt. But, I guess, if this is the price of having average special teams, I suppose we will gladly pay it because we've seen the alternative. And if the 53rd man on the roster has to be a special team only guy for us to have the 13th ranked special teams, that's okay. It's fine enough. Whatever.
Yeah. What's it? I mean, they should just have a separate category here for position and not try to squeeze them into one of the other positions, because it's really like we have a special team slot for Levitt, and seems like Zane Anderson and maybe Eric Wilson But, one thing is like Ford, I think, was originally signed to be a special teamer. Remember when he first came in last year, it was like a gunner. We think about, oh man, with him and Keyshawn as gunners, they're like on top of
and he was
the punt returner every time.
He was an insane gunner. Like when you watch him as a gunner, and they slowly stopped having him do it as much as he took on more of a role in safety.
Now he's one of our 2 starting safeties,
which is probably not ideal, but don't worry about it. It'll be fine. It's a growth year.
And so I had in my initial one, I had one of the safeties wrong here. I had Tarvarius Moore instead of Jonathan Owens, and I didn't get around to updating yet after Moore got hurt. Or maybe I thought was listening to them saying that he would be back soon. But on the plus side, Simone Biles is still a Packers fan.
Yes, that is definitely a plus. Moving on to special teams, though, because I think, the safety room's not the best. It is what it is. Special teams, Anders Carlson, kicker, Daniel Whelan, punter, and he has changed numbers from 41 to 19, so thank goodness for that, because 41 was an awful punter number. And then Matt Orzek, long snapper. My thoughts is it's exciting for Whelan. I read that he is the first Irish-born NFL player in the last 40 years. According to Justice Mosqueda, this is some real special team sicko stuff, so shout out him for charting this, but Carlson was 4 for 4 on kicks in preseason while Whelan was holding, so that's a good sign, because I think that was my biggest concern with keeping Whelan instead of O'Donnell, was like, I think the most important thing is that Carlson feels comfortable in the whole operation there, and maybe he'd feel more comfortable with O'Donnell, but he was perfect with Whelan holding in preseason. It's not going to stay perfect, but, that's at least something. And then they saved a lot of money by keeping Whelan. The Packers also gamed the system with Orzek by kind of cutting him and then re-adding him. Dad, do you want to talk a bit about that? Shout out to him for letting us do that.
Right, so it sounds like the Packers and Orzek had a deal before he was cut that he would re-sign. And the reason they were able to do this is that Orzek was a vested veteran, which means he cannot be claimed off waivers. So nobody can sign him and keep the Packers from getting him without like Orzek's consent. And so they were able to sign and say, okay, we got a deal. We're gonna cut you for now, just so we can stash somebody on IR after the final cutdowns and then sign him back, which they did. The other thing I wanted to say about Whelan is the holding was I thought if he can't be a holder, then I think they would have gone with O'Donnell because Whelan's got looks like a much stronger leg, much more hang time, able to boom it further downfield. One of O'Donnell's things is sort of the ability to kind of put it in the corner or pin deep, close to the goal line, from a position that a lot of people would say you should never punt from again anyway, when you're in like midfield.
And I think Zach Cruz had this on Twitter. I mean, O'Donnell wasn't great for the Packers last year. This was Zach Cruz on Twitter, like I said. He was PFF's number 28 overall punter last year. He was 29th in net punting average, and he was 33rd in hang time. So it's not like O'Donnell was doing a whole lot of like completely irreplaceable punting last year for the Packers. Just like as a note, like, so, it's not like they're cutting like a top 10 level punter for this like unproven rookie, who is also, I read, the all XFL punter this past year in the XFL, I believe I read.
I think I missed it. He was the first team all XFL punter, or so I had this, but I know he's like, everybody was talking in the practices about how much he was like booming punts and like timing like plus 5 second hang times, and that it all looked like it was he was really doing well.
Yeah, and then so beyond that, I don't really have any other notes. I think it's not surprising that it's Orzek and Carlson. Beyond that 53, though, on the PUP, they had Eric Stokes, so that means he has to miss at least 4 weeks. On IR, they have Tyler Davis, which will be season-ending, and then Luke Tenuta on short-term IR. He will also have to miss at least 4 weeks. Players that they waived with injury designations that reverted to Packers IR, these are players that's kind of likely will be cut with injury settlements, and that means they will probably not end up back with the Packers. But we don't know yet as to the like finality of that. And that's Tarvarius Moore, the safety, Broughton Hatcher, the long snapper, Tyler Goodson, and Lou Nichols, running backs. Just a shame that none of them really got much of a chance with their injuries. Dad, anything on those before we talk a little bit about the practice squad?
Yeah, I'd say both Tyler Goodson and Lou Nichols had their sort of training camp cut short by injuries and didn't really get a chance to finish their audition, you might say, for the spot.
Yeah, and it's a real shame because, I think they were excited about Lou Nichols. They spent a draft pick on him. I was really excited about Goodson because, he had looked so good last preseason, and it had been a shame he didn't make the team last year, and then it felt like this year he was coming back, and he had said, it's not like it's a failure if I don't make the 53 this year, and to have it kind of taken out of his hands really sucks. But on to the practice squad for the Packers. They have 17 spots this year because of the exemption for Kenneth Odumegu because of the International Pathway Program. But they kept Austin Allen, tight end, Corey Ballantyne, corner, Keyshawn Banks, edge, Grant DeBose, wide receiver, James Empey, center, Enos Gaines listed as a safety in the corner, but he's really more of just a slot corner right now, Alex Magoo at quarterback, Bo Melton, wide receiver, Aaron Mosby, edge, Henry Pearson, fullback, Benny Sapp, safety, Chris Slayton, D-line, Patrick Taylor at running back, Kadeem Telford, O-line, Keandre Thomas at corner, Christian Welch, linebacker, who was with the Ravens and then signed Thursday, possibly instead of Ford. Something to keep an eye on there if Ford ends up coming in and possibly maybe taking Chris Slayton's spot. Unclear. That's all just speculation. And then Odumegu, like we said. Kind of makes sense. It makes sense to have 3 corners there when you only have 4 corners on the roster. Dad, any other thoughts? I thought Pearson looked good in camp. Bo Melton is a real speedster and good special teamer. Austin Allen, I think, had his moments in preseason games. I thought Keyshawn Banks had a really good preseason, and then they're just stacked with edges right now. Anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I would say the one thing that surprises me right now is that they haven't brought Ford back, and so today would have been the day they could first sign back Ford and Carpenter, who were cut when they got their waiver claims for Sims and
Zane
Anderson.
Yeah, I was gonna say Zane.
And so I was expecting that they were actually going to, and they had one spot left open today because they had only signed 16 to the practice squad, and they were able to have 17 because of the international player program. And so, but instead of signing Ford, or either one, Carpenter went to the Steelers, and they signed Christian Welch as a linebacker. So we'll see what happens with Ford. He's basically a free agent now, can go wherever he wants. He has not yet, as far as at the time of this recording, signed with anyone. We don't know if he wants to come back to the Packers. Maybe he wants to go somewhere else. It's total speculation at this point. In terms of other Packers players who are cut in and have gone elsewhere, Shamar Jean-Charles signed to the 49ers practice squad after he was cut.
And it sounded like they wanted to bring him back, but because the initial reporting was they cut him with and whoever reported was like they're interested in bringing him back to the practice squad, but it sounded like he was like, okay, like I've been here a few years, I've never really been able to kind of like break through to like getting a real like spot on the roster or like getting real playing time. I'm gonna go try and get that playing time somewhere else, which is like fair enough, you know.
Yeah. And was it kind of another interesting note on the whole waiver claim process? So the Packers were able to get 2 waiver claims in Sims and Anderson, but they actually put in a third for Elijah Higgins, who is a rookie from Stanford. He played wide receiver at Stanford and is apparently converting to tight end in the NFL. So he's a big-bodied receiver. And he had the most claims of any player, with 5 teams interested in grabbing him. And so he ended up going to the Cardinals, who had the highest priority. And the Packers missed out on him. And so that's kind of interesting in light of maybe they were thinking of him as a tight end as well.
Yeah, and that kind of wraps up what we had to say about the roster. But one last thing is, because everything should be a competition, you know, got to go out there and compete. We have to look at how we did on our 53-man roster projections, Dad. And looking at it, we're actually really close this year. We both got 48 out of 53 right, missing a handful there. And we went to our tiebreaker of practice squad picks. I got 8 of 16.
I got 10 of 16. So you know who wins.
Yeah, and unfortunately...
Winner, chicken dinner.
The old man got 10 of 16. Every dog has his day.
Deadpool wins.
A broken clock is right twice a day. Whatever phrase you want to use. I was beaten this year by a hair. By 2 players on the practice squad.
Two. Not one. Two.
By 2 players on a practice squad with a tiebreaker. But anyway, I'll get you next year. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. Like we said, we'll be doing a pregame pod next week for the Bears game, for opening opening day for the Packers, I guess is a day game. Like we said, we're going to move to 2 episodes a week after that, which is very exciting. If you like what you heard here, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. Like we said, we tweet out articles, news, videos, when we have new episodes, etc., etc. Come subscribe to us on YouTube, your podcast platform of choice, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. Thanks again so much for listening. We'll be around with everything you need Packers-wise all throughout this year. Very exciting. Going into our second year, we got some great new stuff coming for you. And until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.